So, Larry, a good part of the week this week was given over to talk about recession on the one hand and inflation on the other. We heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell for 2 straight days up on Capitol Hill. Let me ask you the most basic question. As you look forward to the economy, what do you think the biggest risk is right now we face?
Look, I think, David, that a recession is almost inevitable. Probably a 75%, 80% chance within the next 2 years, and there's certainly a real risk that it will come sooner. That's going to be a very difficult thing, though, as I say, I think it may be inevitable given where we are. But I think it's going to be very important to make sure that if we're going to go through a period of pain, we do slay the inflation dragon. You know, there have been many failures, particularly the 1970s are the classic example of where economic policymakers did the equivalent of stopping their antibiotic when they felt better, but before the 10-day dose was through. And so it's a very, very difficult set of balances and challenges that the Fed's going to have, and I very much hope that they make wise choices.
So I take your point that the only thing worse than having a recession is having one without slaying the inflation dragon, as you say. But let me ask you, at this point, some people are predicting this will be a fairly short and shallow one. Do we have reason to believe that? I hope
they're right. I think the question's going to be how much recession is going to be part of eliminating inflation, and that goes back to the whole debate about team transitory. If most of inflation is transitory, then we're not going to have to live with very much pain to get the inflation out of the system. If more of it is more ingrained, then we're going to have to live with more difficulty. I was mildly encouraged by the number that came out today suggesting that long-term inflation expectations as measured in Michigan had gone up a little less than people originally thought. But I still do think we have a meaningful amount of inflation that we have to get out of the system. And I don't think we're going to do that in 1 or 2 quarters of economic slack. But look, there is no reason why this needs to resemble the recessions of the last generation. This should not be anything like what happened after COVID. This should not be anything like what happened after the great financial crisis. Just how deep, just how long it will be, difficult to know, but most people remember the last 2 recessions, and I don't see any reason why we're headed for difficulties of that kind.
One of the things that Chair Powell testified about this week was neutral rate that he still thinks is about 2.5%. I wonder if you agree with that. And then going on to say we may have to go somewhat over that. Some people think he has to go well over that. Where are you?
Look, I think that talking about the neutral rate without talking about the rate of inflation is basically illogical. And so when he says the neutral rate is 2.5%, he's assuming that the inflation rate will be 2%, which I don't think is to be assumed without the right kinds of policies. So my guess is we're going to have to go well above 2.5% on interest rates. Ultimately, in the long run, when we get through this inflation episode, I think there's a substantial chance that we're going to return to the kind of secular stagnation situation we had before COVID, which could mean a neutral rate below 2.5%. So I think we're going to have to be very careful and monitor to track what's happening. But I wish Chairman Powell would start framing the neutral rate as a real interest rate concept that at any moment is dependent on the underlying rate of inflation, and stop just using a nominal figure that assumes so much of what is at issue.
Staying with Chair Powell's testimony, again, he also testified a fair amount on both days of the hearings, actually, about the housing industry and the fact that necessarily the increased rates are hurting the housing industry. He even suggested that at least in some places in the country, we may have housing prices go down. How big a threat is that to the economy? Because that is something we saw back during the great financial crisis.
I think we're in a much less precarious situation in housing than we were during the great financial crisis. but house prices have run way up, and I wouldn't be surprised, given what's happened to mortgage rates, if at least in many parts of the country there was some backtracking of house prices. My assessment is that that's not going to pose the kind of systemic financial risk that it did during the great financial crisis. But as is always true when there's excess, the people who get in last find it expensive. And I suspect that there are going to be people who hit the top when they bought houses sometime in the last 3 to 6 months. And I wouldn't be surprised if for some interval they see a decline in the price of their house.
Larry, quite beyond any testimony up on Capitol Hill, we also had two very dramatic opinions come down from the Supreme Court of the United States. I know that you're not a constitutional lawyer, at least not that I'm aware of. At the same time, I wonder what you think about that decision with respect to the Second Amendment and guns, and also then at the end of the week with respect to abortion. You have talked on this program before about your concerns about the institutions of democracy in this country.
I'm worried about a Supreme Court that so radically breaks with its own precedent, that is so fully in the life of the country. And I wonder if that doesn't raise questions more broadly about the predictability and continuity of policy, the extent to which there are very strong checks and balances in our democracy. By my personal values, both these decisions were appalling, but you know, everyone has their values, and there are other people who would have very different values. What I think is in some ways the more fundamental issue is this question of reversing precedent and mandating things that have really not been acceptable for many years. I can't help but feel that the decision that it's illegal and unconstitutional to stop people from carrying concealed weapons, that goes a long way for me. And I think Roe v. Wade has been so much part of American life that to remove it completely in the way they did with a completely divided court is a kind of fairly shocking act. And I say that as someone who believes very much in deference to the court. I was not one of those who attacked the court for the Bush v. Gore decision, though it was not a decision I liked or supported. I was not one who was prepared to attack the court for the decision they made in Citizens United, the case about corporate funding of politics, though that was a decision that I didn't like. I think these really are quite radical decisions of a particular kind in terms of changing longstanding Supreme Court views, and that does concern me in very fundamental ways.
Larry, let's wrap up with one of your favorite pastimes, golf. I remember you got a hole-in-one this year, as I recall. We have this real dispute now in professional golf between, on the one hand, the PGA, on the other hand, live golf. What do you think about what's going on with that new upstart?
You know, David, in some ways, it's a fight between the highly entitled and the highly privileged. But I think it says something really quite interesting about our broader economy. When you had the PGA with a monopoly, you had a certain distribution of rewards between golfer number 3 and golfer number 103. Now, when the whole thing gets competitive, the superstars are going to get more if they go to the LIV, and in order to keep them, they're going to get more staying with the PGA. I think that's a metaphor for a lot of what's happening in our economy, whereas there's more and more competition, more and more ability to discern who the superstars are, there's some pulling away of the superstars and some loss of solidarity, not as a consequence of market forces. And that's a very difficult thing to think about because there's a lot of efficiency coming from those market forces. It's why I think having a progressive tax system is so much more important, because I think we should be allowing the kind of competition for the greatest talent that this thing represents, but that at the same time we want to have a society where there's some degree of solidarity and everybody has a chance. And so allowing market forces to operate with progressive taxation is, I think, the right answer.
Okay,
More
Larry.
progressive taxation.